Why do I think that saying TikTok is banned is misleading? Because there's been a lot of misinformation about this. That is at the heart of this entire issue. TikTok is not banned. I just don't think it's only TikTok. It's Meta, it's X, it's every app, it's every company that is improperly using, selling, disseminating personal information and private information of US citizens. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. Let's face it, it shouldn't be shared with anybody. The US has been so far behind in its privacy laws. First Amendment rights were really not at issue here. In the oral arguments, to just not understand the issue. And that was one of the biggest mistakes made. And it's shocking. It is shocking. But the biggest issue is welcome to the latest episode of the Deal Making with Laura DiFrancesco and We Grow Together podcast. I'm really excited to be talking today about the TikTok ban. Breaking news, the TikTok has been banned. It is now not official in the app stores. And if you open it up, there's a notice that basically it's been banned and a plea basically for President Trump to reconsider it. So I'm going to talk all about my background, because I think whenever you're hearing someone's analysis or opinion about anything, you should always understand the lens through which they are thinking about it and sharing about it. So I'll tell you a little bit about me and how that influences this. I'm a corporate attorney. I have negotiated over $10 billion of transactions since opening Dean Street Law. I've been a corporate attorney for over 10 years, so this is well within my wheelhouse, but I'll share a little bit more about that as well. I'm also going to talk about the intersection of how law works in the US. If you want to be a lawyer, if you're in business, this is absolutely critical to understand how the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch all interact with one another, and how particularly that has come into play in the case with TikTok. I'm also going to be speaking about the backgrounds of the laws that are relevant to the TikTok decision. The Supreme Court just made the decision to uphold the federal court's decision to ban TikTok. And actually, that in and of itself is very confusing. We're also going to break down what does it mean that TikTok's banned, because TikTok necessarily is not banned. There is a lot that actually goes into that. And so I think it can be confusing. I think there's been a lot of misinformation about it, like there always is. And then we're also going to be talking about the impacts that this has on individuals, businesses, mergers and acquisitions, and corporate law in general. I specialize in mergers and acquisitions, and this is going to have wide-ranging impacts on mergers and acquisitions, corporate law, business, foreign business in the US. And then also, we're going to talk about the mistakes that have been made by absolutely everybody with respect to this issue, because I think the mistakes that have been made both in the press in talking about the TikTok ban, the parties in arguing why it should be banned, are all so rife with so many mistakes that it confuses the issue, it confuses US citizens, and it confuses everyone abroad too, because I think it shows something in a light that is not particularly helpful. And I want to share how those mistakes that have been made across the board really impact that. And of course, how working with good attorneys who know what they're doing, who know negotiation, arguments, all can be so pivotal to your success in business, because it is wild. If you listen, I've listened to the oral arguments, I've read the Supreme Court decision. It is wild how evident it is where good arguments, sound negotiations, and reasoning and logic all will win the day, and how that impacts everything. If you haven't listened to the oral arguments, you need to. I want to shout out an incredible attorney who ran circles around other parties. Elizabeth Prelogar, I hope that I pronounced her name correctly, ran circles around the other parties. She's the US Solicitor General. Her arguments were so good and ultimately were the reason why the Supreme Court decision came out the way it did. They did note in the Supreme Court decision, specifically in writing, in specifically in the oral arguments, the Supreme Court justices did say how lacking the briefs were and how much differently this would have played out earlier on if some of the arguments that have been made were made earlier. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about who we are. I want to thank everybody for joining us, tuning in, all of the subscribers to the Deal Making with Laura DiFrancesco and We Grow Together podcast. This is our first joint podcast. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to both of our podcasts, Deal Making with Laura DiFrancesco and We Grow Together podcast. If you're into mergers and acquisitions, businesses, buying a small business, selling a small business, negotiations, all of those types of corporate law, mergers and acquisitions type of content, Deal Making with Laura DiFrancesco breaks down so many of these concepts and make it accessible, whether you're buying a business, selling a business, interested in growing your business through acquisitions, whatever the case may be. If you're an entrepreneur, an ambitious individual, you like lifestyle, wellness, entrepreneurship, business, supporting small businesses, the We Grow Together podcast shares stories all about how we can learn from one another. That is our philosophy at my businesses, is we grow together. I believe in sharing stories of others and my own stories, having built 5 businesses, running 5 businesses, and through my career negotiating multi-million and multi-billion-dollar transactions, what those takeaways are so that we can all learn and grow together. I hope that you support our podcasts, subscribe, give us a shout out, share on social media. That is the best way to support small businesses, whether you're liking, commenting, sharing it with friends or colleagues, or just giving us a 5-star review. Those little things that we each do to support small businesses help in a tremendous way. So if you could do so, take a moment. It would mean the world to us and our small business. But let's talk a little bit about our background. And first, I do want to make a disclosure. Of course, I have read the Supreme Court decision. I have also listened to the oral arguments. I have not read the entire law. I have read synopses. I've read articles about it, but I do like to go to the first source in law, which is the laws and the opinions. And so those are what I've gathered together for today for this conversation. I also want to note it is January 19th of 2025. This is an ever-evolving issue, and it will continue to be an ever-evolving issue. So this may be relevant to what's been known and shared today, but may evolve and may continue to evolve. And of course, while I am an attorney, this is not legal advice. You should work with a wonderful attorney. And if you want to do so, we specialize in corporate law here at Dean Street Law, and specifically mergers and acquisitions. So a little bit about me and my background, so you know the lens through which you are hearing this and I am sharing this. I went to law school at Villanova Law. I got my GAD and MBA there. I have always had a corporate focus. I worked in big law for 7, 8, 9 years. I forget the exact number, probably around 8 years before starting my own law firm, my corporate law firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions. That's Dean Street Law. Since starting Dean Street Law 5 years ago, we've closed over $10 billion of transactions in corporate law, commercial law, mergers and acquisitions. Our specific focus is lower middle market mergers and acquisitions. And in addition to that, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I have more than 5 businesses. Dean Street Law, as I mentioned, Flourish Co-working and Event Space in Westchester, Pennsylvania, Ethereal Farms, luxury farm accommodations with Airbnbs, VRBOs, and all next to my fiance and his brother's winery and vineyard, Wayvine Winery and Vineyard, not part of my portfolio, but just so you know. And then we also have Laura DiFrancesco, which is the educational platform. We have courses on acquisitions, business, lifestyle design, entrepreneurship, all of those things. And then I have some real estate and investment entities as well. So that is the majority of my portfolio of companies. I am an entrepreneur. I am a corporate attorney. I think about things from the legal perspective. And I also went to University of South Carolina and triple majored in international business, finance, and real estate in 3 years because I wanted to understand international business, which is at the heart of this, and how all of that influences business. And so continued that on with that in my JD and MBA, and then continued on in big law, and then in my own businesses and law. So I have a very vested interest in this as a small business owner who shares content on TikTok, as a mergers and acquisitions attorney who advises clients on buying and selling businesses and regulatory risks, as a corporate attorney who talks about contracts and intellectual property and security of private data information. So this is something that I think of through multiple lenses, both for my own personal interests as a attorney who's always focused on being the best attorney that I can be, and also an entrepreneur who's always focused on building the best businesses that I can and being the best entrepreneur that I can be. I have a very neutral political affiliation. Almost no one in my life knows who I would vote for. So this is not going to be a political podcast at all. This is all about the business implications of this and how this is going to impact individuals and businesses in the US and across the US. So let's get into a little bit of the background. Why do I think that saying TikTok is banned is misleading? Because TikTok is not banned. What has happened is that the Supreme Court made a decision that the ownership of TikTok is not in the best interests from a security perspective of US citizens. And there's a lot to unpack there, and we're going to go into that in further detail. And so TikTok could operate today if they decided to divest TikTok Inc., the US company, from ByteDance, the Chinese company. And we're going to go into that in so much more detail. But TikTok is not banned. The Supreme Court did not ban TikTok. The Supreme Court opined that the ownership structure is a concern for national security risks, and it upheld a law determined by Congress that it has national security concerns. So there's a lot of history. People have been going back and forth for 4 or 5 years at this point of whether TikTok would be banned or not. And there's been a lot of different evolutions in that we'll quickly go over. But that's why people have talked for so long, oh, TikTok won't be banned. So many entrepreneurs, so many content creators have just dismissed this because they said, oh, well, it's been going on for 5 years. It won't actually be banned. And what has happened is the Supreme Court said that because the divestiture has not occurred and because TikTok continues to be owned by a foreign company, and the data that flows through TikTok, personal data of not only users but non-users, flows through the TikTok Inc., the US entity, into the foreign entity ByteDance, which is by law compelled to share that information with the Chinese government when determined. Because that is still the case, it has been removed from the app stores, and when you go to TikTok itself, it has a notice that you can't interact with it because this decision has been made. So TikTok itself is not banned. It is the ownership that is at issue, and I think that's why it's misleading. And I also think that this can create a lot of confusion across the board, whether it be mergers and acquisitions or ownership of companies by foreign entities, whether that be foreign individuals or foreign entities. Overall, the discussion around this has been really unclear. So let's actually clarify it so that you can go away from this conversation having information necessary to really understand what is at play here, what the implications are for you, for your small business, for mergers and acquisitions. Because as we'll say, I think there's been a lot of mistakes here, but it does have, no matter what it is, the implications that it has. And so I do want to make it clear that there's so much talk about foreign adversaries and US versus China. And I think that creates this perception that US is against China in some way. And I want to take a step back first and address that. There is no US citizen widespread anti-China belief. there is an issue that's been an issue in Chinese government that has hindered US companies' ability to do business abroad. And actually, I learned about this at University of South Carolina in my international business program, and it has been foundational to my understanding about business for a long time that I don't think enough people understand. And so in the Chinese government, there is a law that the Chinese government has the right to determine and mandate, control. They may force a US business that does business in China to give their assets, whether that be intellectual property, privacy data, data information at all, or could be assets, real estate, whatever the case may be. The Chinese government may seize any assets or information of businesses that are operating and headquartered in China. That has been a huge reason why US businesses have struggled to expand in China. They decide either to take the risk and risk whether or not they are going to have control or even ownership of those assets that they start in China, or they decide not to expand in China and not be able to access the market and be participating in the Chinese marketplace. So on the whole, I think everybody in the US as entrepreneurs would love to do better business with China, but that has been one of the biggest challenges to doing business in China. And so that is at the heart of this entire issue. It is not a US versus China thing. It is not a US government versus China thing. It is the fact that US businesses or Chinese businesses have to have this level of lack of independence and control by the Chinese government over them, and lack of ability to negate that control. That is fundamentally different than what we see in the US. When we had the US government trying to compel Meta, at that time Facebook, to give up recordings or information or private data of US citizens due to privacy security concerns to the US government, it was upheld that that could not be shared. And so while there are parts of various laws, et cetera, that under a national emergency, the US government may seize some things, et cetera, historically, and I think it would be continue to be in the future, extremely difficult for the US government to do so unless it was literally war times and the most fundamental necessary need. And I think it would still continue to be pushed back incredibly by US citizens because there is such a strong need to protect freedom in the US. It's constitutional, it's a part of our culture, it is everything that everybody here would fight for. And so fundamentally, if we just take a step back and forget about the laws that have been passed and forget about the legal arguments, fundamentally, that's the issue here. And because of how people don't take the time to explain the laws and the challenges of doing business in China or the challenges of doing business with entities based in China, because they're subject to those laws as well, is really the heart of the issue here. So that's kind of taking it a 30,000 step view back here. Now, there's a lot, though, in terms of going into the specific issues and getting everybody a little bit more aware of what's happened. There's a lot that you need to know, and I'm going to make this super quick so that it's not boring, but I think you do need to know a little bit of the interactions of our legislative branch, our executive branch, and our judicial branch to see how what has been going on for the last 4 or 5 years has actually happened today. So, super quick overview of constitutional law. And this is something I actually really enjoyed in law school at Villanova. I really enjoyed going over the legislative branch, executive branch, and judicial branch, because if you are running a business, if you're an individual and concerned about your civil liberties, anybody doing business in the US as a US consumer, as a US citizen, as a US business, has a vested interest in understanding how these branches function and how they relate to one another, because it will directly influence you at some point in your life. Let's break it down so quick, so sweet, so simple, so that you understand and have context and framework for not only this legal issue, but any legal issue that you care about or are concerned about. Legislative branch. This is Congress, and Congress is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. They develop policies, statutes, and laws. There's checks and balances. So imagine a Venn diagram where you have 3 circles. There's checks and balances across all of these so that we have a protection for our civil liberties, and so that there isn't one that could overpower them all. And so you saw this all play out in this TikTok case as it's developed over the last 5 years. Now, Congress is made up of, as I said, the Senate and the House of Representatives. They create laws, but the president can veto those laws. And that has happened. Also, Congress can then override a president's veto if they have a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. Okay, so we've got legislative branch, Congress, led by Congress. That is the development of laws. The laws can be checked and balanced in a few different ways. First, the president has a check and balance by being able to veto, but if it's so important, Congress can go back and decide that it has a 2/3 majority vote in the House and Senate to override that veto. Then the court can deem whether that law is constitutional or not. The court led by the Supreme Court. That's your judicial branch. Your executive branch is led by the president, but it includes government agencies and our military, and they enforce laws made by Congress. So where the president has veto power over Congress, also Congress has veto power over the president. So Congress can reject or modify executive orders. And then the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, for instance, can rule whether executive orders are constitutional or not. So there's some checks and balances all across the board. And then the president also influences the Supreme Court and the judicial branch because they appoint the federal judges, and that does require Senate approval, but that does include the Supreme Court nominees. So you'll see that be a very big issue. I do think this is one of the biggest weaknesses in our overall checks and balances system, is that you have one person that appoints the Supreme Court justices. Although, yes, it is confirmed by Senate approval, it gives one person a lot of power. I do think actually this is our biggest weakness in US government structure, and I do think that those Supreme Court justices should be elected by a popular vote of the people. I think that's been one of the biggest weaknesses that we've seen in a long time, because I don't think that those small group of people always represent the US opinion and the US population. With that said, the judicial branch then interprets and opines on laws and regulations and whether or not they are constitutional. As a lawyer, as a judge, we have the obligation to uphold the Constitution, the obligation to uphold the laws. The Congress can then, if they decide that they don't like what the Supreme Court decided, they can then pass new laws or amend the Constitution to address decisions that are made by the Supreme Court. They can deem the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, can deem laws unconstitutional and also block executive orders. So this whole set of checks and balances of the legislative branch, executive branch, and judicial branch have all been in play for the last 5 years with respect to TikTok specifically. So let's talk about how those all came into play. In 2020, then President Trump, made an executive order using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act gives the president authority to regulate economic transactions with foreign entities where there is a declared national emergency involving a threat from abroad. Now, that executive order was eventually struck down because it was overly broad. With that said, there's a bit more nuances here. So it's a tool that a president can use to address threats from abroad. The biggest issue here that I think the lawyers and TikTok and ByteDance overall have ignored and not understood the importance of is that it's a national security threat. Now, I have my own opinions about certain things. Yes, I agree it's a national security threat. I just don't think it's only TikTok. I think there is a national security threat and a constitutional violation of privacy laws that anybody's individual data is shared and gathered and sold the way it is. It's not just TikTok, it's Meta, it's X, it's every app, it's every company that is improperly using, selling, disseminating personal information and private information of US citizens, of citizens abroad. I think that's a fundamental constitutional right to our privacy that is in breach of, that multiple companies are in breach of. So I'm going to take a step off of my soapbox. We're going to get into mistakes everybody's made later. But I just want to say that the President Trump at that time used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to declare a national emergency. A national emergency must be declared, and then used that to block foreign-owned companies. They have the right under that act to block foreign-owned companies, seize assets, prevent transactions. President Trump used his rights under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act back in 2020 to try to stop TikTok from sharing sensitive user data information and non-user data and information to the Chinese government and to foreign governments. Now, that was blocked and deemed null and void, etc. The background for that and why that all made sense, and we kind of jumped into it before, but let me go into it in a little bit more information, is that TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese company. TikTok Inc. is a US-based company, but it directly shares all of its data, user and non-user data. So it not only collects data from users about location, about viewing and behaviors, but also all of the contact information, name, email, location, tracking, all of that information it collects about users. In addition to that, TikTok and other apps and other companies also collect non-user data. So when you're asked, and I've never once said yes to this, and I hope you start to decide that you should never say yes to this, when an app asks, can it connect with your contacts? Say no. The reason is because TikTok and other apps use that information from your contacts. Your contacts are not consenting for their information to be shared. First of all, that's your personal violation of their privacy, sharing their contact information with an app. They did not consent to it, and they have no way to stop you from sharing that information. Their location, their photos that they've shared with you, anything in their contact information, and sometimes more than that, could be going into your text messages, could be going into your other apps. For instance, Temu also connects and sees everything that you're doing on your other apps. It can share other people's information, and that is a blatant violation of privacy rights of US citizens, in my opinion, it's a fundamental constitutional right of every person across the board. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes. We're going to go into that later, but it's hard not to get onto these just little tangents here and there because that's so fundamental here that everybody missed. And so because all of that user and non-user information is being shared, not just at TikTok, so it's collected, it's stored in a data management system operated by Oracle in Virginia. But TikTok itself has stated that all of that information is shared with ByteDance. And so even though it's on servers in Virginia, it's all shared with ByteDance for the algorithm and other purposes. And it's also been proved that it's been used by Chinese government officials to target certain individuals as well. Trump tried to use his powers under his executive branch as the president to issue an executive order to ban TikTok in 2020 due to TikTok's collection of data, which is a national security concern. Just for your information, TikTok collects data on the 170 million US users. That does not include all of the non-user data that it also collects from every single person that allows it to access their contacts. And they use that for the algorithm, for deciding content, but they also use that to gather information. TikTok and ByteDance have never once proven that that information is not shared with the US or with the Chinese government. And in fact, it has been proven that it has been shared with the Chinese government. And they have never, TikTok nor ByteDance have never stated that they won't share that information with the Chinese government, or that TikTok won't share that information with ByteDance, and in fact have said that it is impossible to continue operating the app without sharing all of that sensitive information. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. So when you have information, you can parse apart that information so that it's not collecting data on one individual, but just rather aggregating all of that data and essentially de-identifying all of that data. But it's TikTok, ByteDance have never once said that they would do that, that it would be a very easy way to act in good faith to address the national security concerns that are here at issue, not only with TikTok. We're going to see this is going to be across the board with lots of different companies, but this is showing the precedent here of what's at issue. Thinking about buying a business? Unlock the secrets of successful acquisitions with Acquisition Insights, your legal roadmap for success. With over 81 modules of video lectures, written materials, guides, and checklists, we provide in-depth guidance to navigate every step of the process. From initial interest to closing the deal, get the expertise you need to make informed decisions. You can also access our battle-tested templates in the Acquisition Insights course and templates bundle, including our template LOIs, letters of intent, pre- and post-LOI due diligence request list, material deal terms lists, and more. Visit lauradfrancesco.co/the-shop today and take the first step towards buying your dream business. All the links are in the show notes. That's one of the biggest issues, is the national security concern. The other issue is the algorithm and deciding content, whether it should be silenced or whether it should be promoted. But as we said, that executive order was struck down as being overly broad. So then, after it was struck down as being overly broad, Congress implemented and passed the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act. Long name. Really, guys, we could do a lot better at naming these things. In short, it gives the U.S. government the right to regulate apps that are owned or influenced by foreign adversaries when they deem it a national security risk. Personally, I absolutely, there should be a protection of U.S. citizens from their data being shared with foreign governments. But I think the big issue here is there should actually be a federal law that it is illegal to gather and sell information about U.S. citizens. It is a violation of privacy. The U.S. has been so far behind in its privacy laws that they've enacted, and that is fundamentally what's at issue here, and the biggest mistake that we'll talk about in more detail later. Anyways, the national security here is preventing foreign governments from accessing sensitive data about U.S. citizens without their consent. Not only U.S. citizens that consent to give their data to these apps, but then those apps having the ability and compulsion to share that data with foreign governments without notifying any of the app users, but also the fact that they're collecting data on non-users and sharing that data and being able to be compelled to share that data with foreign governments as well. Let's face it, it shouldn't be shared with anybody. It's our data, it's our information, it's private data. It shouldn't be shared with anybody. This act also gives the government the right to investigate, restrict, ban apps owned or controlled by foreign adversaries if they pose a risk to privacy, cybersecurity, or public safety. It also prevents those foreign governments from influencing public opinion through technology and platforms. I mean, it was a bipartisan bill that was passed with such strong support on both sides of the aisle, which is extremely hard to do in today's age, that the Supreme Court was obviously of a very strong motivation to support, because it is the U.S. citizens and the representation of the U.S. citizens by such overwhelming support saying, we do not want our data shared with foreign governments. Simple as that. That's non-controversial. Now, the data concerns, let's talk about the data concerns that were argued by the parties. The ByteDance is headquartered in China. The Chinese government can compel ByteDance to share TikTok user data and non-user data under China's national securities laws. It has been one of the biggest challenges to doing business in China, and has been obviously one of the biggest issues here in national security concerns as well. As I said, TikTok collects location, usage, content that's been shared, contents that's been reviewed, personal information, names, phone numbers, emails, and contact information, and information about non-users as well. So that'll be your contacts, notes about your contacts, if you have their child's names in there, if you have their favorite things in there, anything about there. It can be their names, their addresses, if they're sharing their location with you potentially as well. Any other information that's shared in your contact information about that person. And that's without their consent, without that contact's consent. And then there's also a concern about the manipulation of propaganda as well through algorithms also. But the manipulation of propaganda was not the reason why the Supreme Court decision was made in the way that it was made, because there is freedom of speech rights that U.S. citizens and U.S. companies have. Now, let's talk about that briefly. One of the biggest mistakes that I think TikToks and TikTok content creators made was focusing solely on their First Amendment rights, because First Amendment rights were really not at issue here. And that was one of the biggest mistakes made, because the issue is data, privacy, security, and foreign ownership and control and access to information. And yes, First Amendment rights are important, but the app can still be on tomorrow if it just isn't directly sharing all of this, or has the ability to, or may be compelled to share all of this data with the Chinese government. In addition, it does not actually inhibit anybody's free speech, because I have the right to share on any platform as a content creator my thoughts and opinions. It is not a constitutional right to have access to every platform, even if that platform may be violating the law. It is my right to share my opinion, and content creators still have that right to share their opinion. Yes, it was a great app and it had a great algorithm and people enjoyed it, but there's fundamental security concerns here. But the biggest issue is that it's not a freedom of speech issue. The issue is ownership, and the fact that TikTok and ByteDance will not divest TikTok, so that it's not owned by an entity that must provide the Chinese government with all of this data and information. TikTok can continue sharing their information as long as that data does not then report up. That's the whole issue here. And there was no arguments by TikTok's attorneys, by the content creators' attorneys, that the actual issue could be solved. In fact, they said that it couldn't be solved because it couldn't be divested, which I can tell you as an M&A attorney and as a corporate attorney is absolutely not true. And you're not going to get it past Supreme Court justices that you can't divest a company, when we all know that that's not true. They said that they couldn't divest because then they wouldn't have access to the algorithm. Guess what? There's licensing. You could license the algorithm. You could de-identify the information. It's honestly so much of this is lack of cooperation by TikTok and by ByteDance for the last 4 or 5 years, for the fact that they could not solve this very simple issue, which is the protection of U.S. data, U.S. citizens' data and information that were taken without authorization and with authorization. And so ultimately, the reason why the First Amendment argument does not fly in these arguments and in the Supreme Court's decision is because it's not a First Amendment argument. TikTok can continue to speak. They just can't continue to share information back to ByteDance, which then can be shared with the foreign governments. It's so simple. And it's shocking. It is shocking how they continued in the oral arguments to just not understand the issue. And I wasn't even looking back and thinking of it. It was just so obvious. I hope that you listen to the oral arguments if you haven't already, because they're so important. So, right of freedom of speech is, there was so many discussions about, should it be strict scrutiny? Should it be intermediate scrutiny? What should the level of scrutiny be? And they were wasting their time because it doesn't really matter. I think no matter the scrutiny, and we'll talk about this in mistakes, no matter the scrutiny, the result would have been the same. And I think that's why you found so many people consenting to the decision and not necessarily consenting to all of the issues that were here. The Supreme Court decision had to make a decision that made sense, and they had to opine the issue that they were opining on, whether or not freedom of speech was impacted by this. It's simple there, because TikTok can continue speaking today any way they'd like. It's just they can't share that data and information, and they've never said that they won't. Simple. It's so simple. When it comes to navigating corporate law, entrepreneurship, and managing small businesses, experience matters. Dean Street Law is a boutique corporate firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions, and additional focus in real estate, commercial transactions, finance, and corporate governance. With over $10 billion in deals closed, Dean Street Law has extensive experience representing hundreds of clients in thousands of transactions, from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. Whether you need startup guidance or advice on closing multi-million or multi-billion dollar deals, we're your trusted partner every step of the way. Visit deanstreetlaw.com in the show notes to schedule a complimentary consultation. Okay, so now that we know that the issue is ownership and data, let's talk about that. The Supreme Court said that this is content neutral decision. TikTok content creators kept saying, you're trying to opine and say that we can't share certain content, and that wasn't it. And they kept saying, well, you can't tell the Washington Post or the New York Times or Fox News or CNN what their editorial privileges are, so that you can't make a decision about our algorithm and what our editorial decisions were. If you continue to argue the wrong point, you're going to lose. It's so simple as that. The Supreme Court said that the law is content neutral. It's focused on data collection and national security. It is focused on the violation of law by sharing U.S. citizen information with and without their consent to foreign governments. It's so simple. And then the solution that was offered in negotiations for the last 4 to 5 years through the act, as well as the executive order by Trump, is a qualified divestiture. If you are not going to be able to be compelled to send all of this information to the Chinese government, then you can continue operating tomorrow. But they would not cooperate with the last 4 and 5 years. The Chinese government would not let it be divested, and ByteDance would not agree to a divestment, so that it was a change of ownership, so that this information wasn't able to go up to foreign government. And then it does not regulate speech. Yes, there is parts of it talking about manipulation of information and propaganda and whatnot. But the core issue here, and the reason why the ban was upheld, is because it was not regulating speech, it was regulating ownership. And then I do think it's super important to also note, because there's been a lot of misinformation about this, the Supreme Court did not weigh in the redacted, secured data that was shared with it by the US government. And there was a great comment by the US Solicitor General when the Supreme Court justice asked whether, they were talking about all the data that's been shared with ByteDance and potentially also, but I think they also argued also the Chinese government. And they said, well, that's redacted information. And she came back with, and it was so great, such a great moment. She came back with, yes, that is actually TikTok's redacted information. And so they have access to all of that redacted information. It is their proprietary confidential information, which is the reason why it was redacted. So there's two sets of redacted information in this case, and there's been a lot of misinformation about that. There is redacted information that has been redacted because it is TikTok's proprietary information, and then there's that so that's under seal. And then there's also security clearance information submitted that was not shown to TikTok. But the Supreme Court did not consider that security clearance information that was not shared with TikTok in its decision. And I think that was the right thing to do in this situation. They did not weigh in on that classified evidence and information, or even the hypothetical alternatives that TikTok produced as well. There was a lot of discussion about covert influence, and that's the manipulation and propaganda and algorithms and everything. And ultimately, that wasn't the issue here. It was ownership and data of US citizens. And then we mentioned that it tracks US citizen information with and without consent. And that, just want to note, that includes government employees, which is very obviously, it's not right for it to be any single US citizen, but of course it creates even more of a national concern when it's also US government employees. Now that I've talked about the background of this information, let's talk about business risk. Let's talk about how this impacts you, your business, your small business, yourself as a content creator, because there's a lot of it. First of all, you have to be aware of foreign laws, not only whether it's directly impacting your business or whether it may be indirectly. This is a big law in China that I've known about for a long time because I studied international law, international business. But you as a business owner, as an individual, need to be aware of foreign laws as well. I know there's a lot going on in the world. There's so much, especially when it talks about foreign laws, but this is one of the big ones to know about. And so it's important to research if you're doing business abroad, if there's any sort of cross-border transactions, that you understand the laws that impact those cross-border transactions. It's at the heart of this case. It's the reason why there's an issue here. So those are really important, especially if you are a foreign company wanting to do business in the US. I think this is going to unfortunately negatively influence foreign companies doing business in the US in a negative way because of mistakes made, because it's not, yes, it should not go to foreign governments' data. Absolutely. But it shouldn't go to anybody. Data about US citizens shouldn't go to anybody. It should be a fundamental constitutional right that we have the right to our privacy. That's been upheld in the EU. They are so much farther ahead. California is so much farther ahead. Our federal government needs to enact laws across the board to protect US data. It is non-negotiable. But that's something I think you will see continue to develop tremendously, especially in the next 5 years. This is setting a huge precedent of how important data is to the US and how important our private information of US citizens is to the US. It's going to be, I think, going to be widely impacting foreign companies, but I think you'll also see it going to be widely impacting US companies as well. In addition, how important it is to have good attorneys who understand the issues, who not only can negotiate, but can drive to the heart of motivations in a negotiation. That is what won this case. It is the U.S. Solicitor General who won the case for the protection of data for U.S. citizens. I hope that this was a beneficial episode if you're looking to learn a little bit more about what's going on with the TikTok ban, even though TikTok itself is not actually banned. It's merely the ownership and sharing confidential information of U.S. citizens all the way up to foreign governments. But I hope it's been helpful if you're trying to learn a little bit more about that in a just neutral business perspective and learning a little bit more about overall laws, how they're made, how they're influenced, and also how you can protect you and your small business. If you are looking to learn more about this, please subscribe to our podcasts, Deal Making with Laura DiFrancesco, all about mergers and acquisitions and corporate law, as well as We Grow Together podcast, all about entrepreneurship, lifestyle design, wellness, and everything like that, sharing stories and learning from one another. Of course, it means the world to us if you leave us a 5-star review, share it with your friends on social media, tag us at Dean Street Law, at Flourish Westchester, at Laura M. DiFrancesco on Instagram, and LM DiFrancesco on. This is just a few minutes after I finished recording. As you can see, the fire has gone out. And already there have been new developments that I want to update you on before I let this go for the day. It is, as I said, an ongoing. It's ironic because exactly what I talked about literally at the end of the episode of what could happen next has happened. President-elect Trump, because today is the 19th, has said that he plans to work with TikTok. And so TikTok has this now notice, thanks to President Trump, that they are allowing access to U.S. users to the app, whereas they weren't previously, because Trump has said that they're going to work with, the Trump administration has said they're going to work with TikTok. With that said, it is still not available in the App Store in Apple and Google. And so if Apple and Google do not deem this enough security, because the Supreme Court and the U.S. Solicitor General both deemed it a violation of law to keep them in the App Store after today. If those app stores do not believe that this is sufficient evidence and security that they can continue to include them in the App Store, which I think is going to be hard based on those oral arguments in the Supreme Court, then they will not have the app in the App Store. So the app will not update. It will not stay consistently available. So it's going to be basically phased out on its own. I do think that this is, without it being a political statement at all, I do think this is a very risky stance for Trump to take, given that he was the one who actually enacted the executive order in 2020 that was proposed to ban TikTok. And then he was on a multi-year negotiation with TikTok that did not amount to anything, and it has not amounted to anything up to this point. And we have the Supreme Court deciding and having already opined on what the president could possibly do. The 90-day extension is about all that he lawfully can do. With that said, it's just punting it down for another 90 days. And the Congress can, of course, then make a change based on this executive order. You're going to see a lot more. This is just the beginning, as it has continued to be. But I do think that we have a lot more teeth to support the TikTok ban, and it'll be interesting to see how this continues to unfold. But hopefully the episode's still helpful regardless, given that this is a very tumultuous time and there's a lot to understand that has not been addressed at this point. Thanks so much for tuning in, and be sure to stay up to date for more, as well as tune in for more episodes here with the Deal Making with Laura DiFrancesco and We Grow Together podcasts.